The King's Choice. King Hellamund had ruled his kingdom wisely for many years when he was called to go on a crusade to the Holy Land. He wanted his realm to be well looked after while he was away, so he turned to the people he trusted most, his 6 counselors. He asked them to swear to rule the kingdom as best they could, to protect his queen and baby boy, and, if he did not return from the holy wars, to hold the throne until his son was old enough to become king. However, King Hellamund could not decide which of the 6 to appoint first counselor. One seemed too old, another too young, a third too impetuous, a fourth too hesitant, a fifth too daring, and the 6th too cautious. One night, as he lay awake, thinking about how to make first counselor, he glimpsed something emerging from his bed's curtains, an apparition of a hooded woman in long, flowing grey robes. He sat up and stared in shock. "Who are you?" he asked. "I am the spirit of the castle," the apparition replied. "I have tried to help all the realm's kings during the most difficult moments. Most of them have either neither seen or heard me, but you can. Lay your head on your pillow." The spirit softly brushed the king's face with the grey robes. Numbness came over him, and he sank down into deep sleep and began to dream. In the king's dream, it seemed to him that he had already set out on the crusade and was far away from the castle. Yet he could still see everything that was happening in his kingdom. He saw his counselors sitting at the council table, quarreling, though he could not see their faces. Only one of them was quietly trying to settle the dispute. Then he saw the 6 men go down into his treasury and fill their pockets with gold. Again, only one of them did not touch the chests and tried to dissuade the rest. Then the king saw the first counselor stride into his throne room with troops of soldiers, announce that King Hellamund was dead, and proclaim himself king in his place. The false king married his queen, imprisoned the little prince in a tower, and put the one counselor who had been loyal into irons. When King Hellamund awoke, he was sweating, and his arms were flailing wildly. The grey apparition was still standing behind his bed. Quickly, the king calmed himself, for he realized that all this was a dream. At the same time, though, he was afraid. Was the strange apparition warning him of what might happen? She nodded, as if she had read his thoughts. "Yes, by this you see the worth of promises and oaths." The king clenched his fists in anger. "If I only knew who was the first counselor, and who the loyal one was," he cried. "But I could not see their faces." "If you wish to know, I can help you," said the spirit of the castle. "Tomorrow, bid your counselors take a golden galley down the river to the jousting grounds on the plain. Meanwhile, ride there yourself. I will be waiting for you where the river meets the forest." The spirit bid the king farewell and disappeared behind the folds of the curtains. The next day, King Hellamund did as he has been told, and invited his counselor to sail down the river in his golden galley for a tournament on the plain. He himself rode ahead on horseback, and when he came to the place where the river meets the forest, he continued along the shore. He had not been riding long before his horse reared up in fright, and the spirit appeared among the tree trunks. "Tie your horse to the oak," she said, "then come back to me." King Hellamund obeyed her. When he returned, the spirit walked towards him, looked at him with her deep-set eyes, and waved her robes gently before his face. She began to speak. "King so high in all the land, that equal stands no other, be transformed, assume disguise, to look a plain woodcutter." Then the king felt an extraordinary change taking place in him. He grew shorter, but broader and stronger. His shining robes became a poor woodcutter's tunic. His hair hung untrimmed around his face, and in his hand he held an axe instead of a sword. "What have you done?" he exclaimed, frightened. "Don't be afraid," she said. "Soon you shall be as before. But now look." She waved her robes across the grass and spoke. "Grow, little cottage, from out of this earth, a building to serve as a poor man's heart." King Hellemund saw a dwelling begin to rise out of the ground, and in a few moments there stood a miserable small croft with a sagging, moss-covered roof and warped little meadow windows. "Here is where you will live," said the spirit of the castle, "and in a little while you will have a chance to do your counselors a service. As a reward, ask that in 3 days they honor your humble craft by coming to a feast." The king opened his mouth to question the spirit, but she had already floated away over the water, where she melted like mist. Soon afterwards he heard voices and sound of oars, and saw the golden galley glide into view. He was watching it and listening to his counselors chatting happily when a sudden windstorm drove across the surface of the water and tossed the galley back and forth so wildly it looked as if it would capsize. Without a moment's hesitation, Hellemund threw himself into the river. He swam towards the galley, boarded it, took the oars from the rowers, and managed to steer the sinking boat to safety. The 6 counselors stepped ashore and thanked the woodcutter for saving their lives. They offered to reward him lavishly. Whatever he wanted, they would grant him. King Hellemund remembered the spirit's words. He took off his cap and bowed. "Noble gentlemen," he said, "I am a humble and lowly man, and I don't know if I dare to ask. But in 3 days I will hold a feast for my friends and neighbors. If you could come to my croft then, it would be the greatest honor I could imagine." The counselors burst out laughing. "Is that all?" they asked. "Yes, noble gentlemen." Once more Hellemund bowed and invited them all to come to the feast 2 hours before sunset. The counselors were still laughing. They found this woodcutter silly and naive, but one after another offered his hand and promised to attend the feast. Then they wrung out their wet clothes, stepped back aboard the golden galley, which the oarsmen had been bailing out, and continued on calmly down the river. As soon as they were out of sight, King Hellemund's woodcutter's clothing disappeared, and he stood a distinguished monarch once more. He mounted his horse and galloped to the jousting field, where he arrived long before the counselors. When they came, they did not say a word about their mishap on the river. They were embarrassed that they had needed help from a humble woodcutter. 2 nights later, King Hellemund was awakened by someone calling his name. When he opened his eyes, he saw the grey-robed apparition beside his bed again. "Tomorrow, King Hellemund, you must hold a great banquet here," said the spirit. "Invite all your noble knights and ladies, and ask your 6 counselors as well." But they have promised to go to the woodcutter's feast in the forest," said the king. "That's just my reason," said the spirit, and in the next moment she was gone. Hellemund sat wondering until he understood, and the next morning he issued invitations to a banquet to begin 2 hours before sunset. When the time came, the great hall in the castle was filled with noble gentlemen, brave knights, and beautiful ladies. The king entered, accompanied by the queen and the baby prince. The king's eyes scanned the assembly eagerly. He was looking for his counselors, and sure enough, there they were, lining up and bowing to him humbly. They had not gone to the woodcutter's cottage. But the king noted that one of the 6 was missing. It was Ismaril, the one he thought was too young to be first counselor. "I don't see the noble counselor Ismaril," said the king. The steward of the household approached. Your Majesty, the noble counselor Ismail sent word he cannot attend because he has already accepted an invitation elsewhere. The king drew himself up and frowned, as he was very, very angry. And does anyone know what high-born person's company Ismail prefers to that of his king? The 5 counselors looked at each other, as if they did not know what to do. However, being secretly jealous of Ismail, they did not want to miss an opportunity to throw him into disgrace. So they went to the king, told him of their adventure with the galley, and of the woodcutter, and of the absurd feast they had promised to attend. The king called several servants to him. Go out to the forest near the river, he commanded. Find Counselor Ismail and bring him to me immediately. The servants left, and the banquet began. No more than an hour had passed when they returned with the missing counselor, whom they had found wandering in the forest, vainly attempting to find the woodcutter's craft. Ismail, with his head high and his back straight, walked up the great hall to the king, who sat quietly observing him. So, said the king, you disdain my banquet for a supper with a woodcutter? He said. The king was silent for a moment. Ismail looked him right straight in the eye with a fearless look. I had promised, he said. The king was silent for a moment. Then you regard the imitation of a common woodcutter more important than your king's summons? I had promised, he said. The king raised his head. Do you mean that a promise to the lowliest of my subjects is more to you than my own grace and favor? Ismail raised his head higher. Yes. The king rose and gestured to the company. What punishment does he deserve? He asked. But the guests only mumbled and whispered among themselves, averting their eyes. You do not answer? Said the king. Then I shall give him the punishment I believe he deserved. He stepped down from the throne, walked towards Ismail, and embraced him tenderly. Then he picked up the little prince and placed him in the counselor's arms. Herewith I appoint you, Ismail, first counselor of the realm. You value your word to the most lowly above all graces and gifts, so I know I can safely place in your hands that which is most precious to me, my life, my lands, and the ones I love. That was the king's choice. Thank you for listening. Until next time, bye-bye.